Hello, everybody. It's me again, the one and only Cave Cat, here once again to bring you another exciting episode of Cave Cat's movie and TV reviews. Today, it's time for us to go back to 1995, back when a certain animated film was introduced to moviegoers the world over. An animated movie that was unlike anything that the world had ever seen before. That movie is none other than Toy Story. Toy Story was first created and produced by Disney in association with Pixar Animation Studios, or just simply known as Pixar. Much like in my Scooby-Doo review, I'm going to be talking about each and every single one of the Toy Story films that have been released. So here we go. Here we come with the original film that started it all. The first Toy Story was released back in November of 1995, and as mentioned before, it was unlike anything that the world had ever seen before. The reason for this is because it was actually the very first computer animated feature film, which was very innovative at the time. I mean, sure, there were a couple of computer animated shows produced prior to this film, such as VeggieTales and Reboot, but never before had there been a computer animated film to have been produced in the history of filmmaking. Once the film was released, it ended up being a huge hit at the box office, even rivaling that of Disney's Pocahontas. So, anyway, for those who don't know, Toy Story tells the story of a young boy named Andy whose favorite toy is a talking pull-string cowboy doll named Woody. But unknown to Andy, Woody, along with the rest of Andy's toys, have the ability to come to life when nobody's around, which I thought was a pretty neat concept for the day. Moving on, things end up taking a left turn for Woody when Andy gets a brand new toy for his birthday, which is an action figure of Space Ranger Buzz Lightyear. So Andy starts sidelining Woody in favor of Buzz. This causes Woody to start feeling upset and jealous that he's been replaced, to the point of actually trying to get Buzz out of the way, though not in the way that he originally intended. I admit that I really love the concept and the plot of the film, because it really gives one a sense of knowing that no matter the hardships that you go through in trying to regain the love of someone you hold dear, they'll never truly replace you in that regard. You can't help but feel bad for Woody when Buzz replaces him as Andy's favorite toy, and especially when the rest of Andy's toys turn against him when he seemingly gets rid of Buzz intentionally, but in actuality it was a complete accident. I mean, sure, Woody was greatly jealous of all the attention that Buzz was getting from Andy, but deep down, you know that he just wanted to be loved again. And in the end, Woody and Buzz are able to put aside their differences, and Woody is able to redeem himself to the other toys once again. I remember that with this movie, my family and I went to see it over the weekend a few days ago after it first opened. And despite my nervousness about the animation of the film, I ended up enjoying the film regardless. I love the plot, I love the animation, and I love the characters. The film introduces us to such great characters as Woody, Buzz, Ham, Rex, Mr. Potato Head, Slinky Dog, Bo Peep, and many others. Andy and his family are also great characters as well, and the main villain, Sid, is the very definition of what happens when children are raised in an abusive environment, especially given his habit of abusing toys for the fun of it, while his dog, Scud, acts like a stereotypical guard dog, mainly when toys are involved. Aside from having a substantial amount of comedy, action, and tense moments, the film also has some heart and tear-jerking moments to it, much like Pixar would also implement into their later films. As mentioned before, you can't help but feel sorry for Woody and what he goes through to try and be loved and regain the trust and loyalty of his friends again. Later on in the film, we even get to see Buzz go through his own doubts and insecurities upon discovering that he really is a toy and not an actual space ranger like he originally thought he was at first. What follows after that is one of the most touching and thought-provoking heart-to-heart scenes, where Woody admits to Buzz that despite being a toy, the best they can do is provide Andy with lots of support and security when he needs the most. It's also very heartwarming to see what Woody and Buzz go through to try and get back to Andy, even in spite of the fact that Andy and his family are preparing to move to a new house. But despite all of this, Woody and Buzz are eventually successful in returning to Andy. Like I said before, I really like the plot and the concept of the film, as well as the other sequels following this one. So for that, I will give Toy Story 9 stars. Now we come to the second film, which is entitled Toy Story 2 and was released in November of 1999, which was roughly 4 years after the original Toy Story was first released. Not to mention that this film was released a year after Pixar had released their second film, A Bug's Life, to theaters. Being that this is a sequel to the first film, the second film follows the further adventures of Woody, Buzz, and the rest of Andy's toys as they go on an all new adventure. This time, Andy is heading off to cowboy camp and intends to take Woody with him, but a short playtime results in Woody getting his arm ripped, so had to be left behind. While this is going on, Woody ends up in a yard sale while trying to save another toy and gets toy napped by a toy collector named Al, who is the proprietor of Al's Toy Barn. So because of that, it's up to Buzz, Ham, Rex, Mr. Potato Head, and Slinky to try and save Woody and bring him back home before Andy returns home. One thing I've heard people say about this movie is that they actually like it a lot better than the original film, because not only is it a continuation of the first film, but it also has its own original story rather than being a rehash of the first film. And also with this film, we get introduced to a lot of new characters, such as Wheezy the Penguin, Mrs. Potato Head, and especially Jessie, Bullseye, and Stinky Pete, who are all revealed to be part of a collection with Woody from an old Western children's show called Woody's Roundup. It's a nice throwback to old Western shows that were shown on TV back in the 50s and the 60s. And like I mentioned before, I have a soft spot for cowboys and westerns. Also, like the first film, the second film has a pretty good balance of comedy, action, heart, and tear jerking moments. We even get to find out about the past of Jesse and especially Stinky Pete, the latter revealed to be the true villain of the film, who is so dead set on wanting to be loved and remembered that he believes that getting sent to a toy museum is the way to do it. Also, I mentioned this briefly in my video talking about why I think that the Garbage Pail Kids cartoon reboot will be successful. But when the movie was in production, one of the staff members at Pixar actually saved this film from getting permanently deleted. This was because someone had accidentally inputted the wrong code key that caused a lot of the files for the film to be deleted. But fortunately, one staff member who was on her maternity leave at the time had a backup copy of all the files and was thus able to save the film. In spite of that little setback, I'm glad that the film was able to see the light of day. And like with the first film, my family and I saw it at the theater during the Thanksgiving weekend, and I enjoyed it just as much as I did the first film. And with that, I will give Toy Story 2 9.5 stars. So, after roughly a little over a decade had passed since Toy Story 2 was first released, we finally get Toy Story 3. Now, this film had been anticipated for quite a long time, even before the crew at Pixar had actually thought of doing a Toy Story 3, even though Stinky Pete name dropped the title during one of the outtakes for Toy Story 2. After such films as Monsters Inc., Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, Cars, Ratatouille, Wall-E, and Up, we finally come to the 11th animated feature film in Pixar's roster, which is the third Toy Story film, Toy Story 3. Toy Story 3 was released in June of 2010, which makes it the first Toy Story film to not be released in November. But moving on from that, Toy Story 3 brings back all of the familiar characters that we all know and love, like Woody, Buzz, Jessie, Bullseye, Ham, Rex, Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head, and Slinky Dog, while also omitting other characters such as Wheezy, RC, Etch-a-Sketch, and especially Bo Peep for some odd reason. At least Bo Peep is able to make a reappearance in Toy Story 4, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Anyway, with this film, Andy is now in his late teens and preparing to go to college, all while having to make a choice about what to do with Woody and the rest of his old toys. Of course, the toys, with the exception of Woody, believe that Andy doesn't want them around anymore, so they get themselves donated to Sunnyside Daycare, where lots of young children come every day to play with toys that have been donated. Much like the previous film, we also get introduced to a bunch of new characters, and not just new toy characters like Lotso, Ken, and many others, but also new human characters such as Bonnie and her mother, as well as Bonnie's toys, ranging from Mr. Pricklepants, Buttercup, Trixie, and Dolly. These characters really feel like they do belong in the Toy Story universe, and they don't bog down the story or the plot at all. Much like the previous films, there's the usual comedy, action, heart, and tear-jerkers, especially the latter regarding the case of Lotso, where we learned that he used to be loved, but after getting left behind, ended up getting replaced, which made him very bitter and unrepentant and ruling Sunnyside with an iron hand, so that only the strong will be treated fairly while the weaker toys get mistreated by the younger kids. Now I gotta admit, Lotso is definitely the most sadistic of the Toy Story villains, being that his past has clouded him so much that he doesn't care in the slightest whether any new toy he sends gets mistreated by younger irresponsible kids, only caring about being treated fairly by older kids. In fact, believe it or not, in the original draft of the first Toy Story, Woody was originally depicted as being a sadistic dictator, much like Lotso is in this film, even intentionally knocking Buzz out the window, as opposed to the accident that it was in the final film. But unfortunately, when Disney and Pixar screened that version to test audiences, it was met with unfavorable responses due to the audiences harboring a great dislike for this portrayal of Woody. That forced Pixar to go back to the drawing board and retool Woody's personality so that he was just jealous yet willing to make up for his mistakes. I agree that the Woody that we're all familiar with is much better than the Woody that Pixar first conceived during the original film's production. But anyway, back to Toy Story 3. The ending of the film is very heartwarming, where after the toys make it back to Andy's house, they, along with Woody, get donated to Bonnie's house while Andy goes off to college. Now, that is just a great way to show that Andy has moved on, while his toys now have a new owner to take good care of them. I have to agree with what a lot of people say. This is definitely a great sequel in the Toy Story franchise, and a great way to end off the series, right? Well, actually, not quite. But anyway, with this film, I give it 8 stars. Alright, now we come to the fourth film in the franchise, which is Toy Story 4. I gotta say, this one is pretty interesting, to say the least. When this film was first announced back in 2018, a lot of people were either confused or outraged because they believed Toy Story 3 the perfect film to end off the series, and that continuing the series with a fourth film would only ruin the ending of Toy Story 3, even in spite of those theatrical shorts and television specials that they made. But at least with this film, even in spite of it being an unnecessary sequel, we get one good thing out of it. We get to see the return of Bo Peep after her absence from Toy Story 3, and there's even an explanation as to why she didn't appear in the previous film. Via a flashback, we learned that between the second and third films, Bo Peep ended up being given away after she and Woody teamed up to save RC from being caught outside on a rainy night. And despite Bo Peep making an offer to Woody for him to come with her, Woody declines because his loyalty still lies with Andy. It's pretty heartbreaking to see Woody have to say goodbye to the girl he loves before she gets taken away to a new home. And what's even more heartbreaking is that after that flashback, we get to see that even in spite of the moving speech that Andy gave to Bonnie in the previous film regarding how special Woody is, Bonnie has been sidelining Woody in a lot of her playtimes with her own toys and Andy's former toys. So, yeah, this is one of the big problems of this film that quite a number of people have been complaining about, which is that Bonnie, despite enthusiastically including Woody in her playtime with her own toys in the previous film, has apparently been losing interest in Woody. This is a huge contrast to how Andy still valued Woody as his most favorite toy alongside Buzz back when he was still really young. I could probably justify it to Bonnie just being a typical kid who will sometimes lose interest in a certain toy, but yeah, I could definitely see why a lot of people would find this to be one of many issues that the film has. Much like with the previous three films, this film also introduces a lot of new characters, such as Forky, Ducky and Bunny, Duke Kaboom, and Gabby Gabby. However, these characters don't really have that spark to them like a lot of the other characters from the previous films do. Forky, despite being a new toy created by Bonnie, with secret help from Woody, of course, doesn't see himself as a toy, but rather as ordinary trash meant to be thrown away, which could be seen as an allegory to someone trying to commit suicide, which is rather dark for a kid's animated film. Ducky and Bunny are just the annoying comic relief, meant to try and emulate Timon and Pumbaa from The Lion King, but they actually come across as being more like Jar Jar Binks from the Star Wars prequel films in a sense. Of course, them being voiced by Key and Peele doesn't really help matters. Duke Kaboom is actually the best new character that this film puts out, not just because he's voiced by Keanu Reeves, aka Ted from the Bill and Ted films and Neo from the Matrix films, but he actually has a pretty fascinating backstory to him. He was actually a Christmas present, or rather a Boxing Day present, since his former owner was a French Canadian boy who ended up being disappointed upon discovering that Duke Kaboom was not as great as the commercial advertised him. In a way, it's almost similar to what Jessie went through in Toy Story 2, but the only difference being that while Jessie's former owner grew up and had her donated, Duke's former owner just threw him away like he was nothing after realizing that Duke didn't do any of the things that he was advertised as being capable of doing. Another issue that I've heard people complain about is the fact that none of the original supporting characters really have much to do. This is especially egregious with the fact that Mr. Potato Head's voice actor, Don Rickles, died 2 years before the film was released and before he could even record any lines, to the point that the filmmakers had to use unused archival footage of Don Rickles' lines as Mr. Potato Head in order to try and make him actually get any lines in. Then again, Slinky's original voice actor Jim Varney died a year after Toy Story 2 was first released, but they still made it work by replacing him with Blake Clark for Toy Story 3 and especially this film. So why couldn't they have gotten someone else to voice Mr. Potato Head to try and replicate Don Rickles' original performance? Also, the way that they had to use archival footage of Don Rickles' performance as Mr. Potato Head for this film reminds me of how they previously used archival footage of the late Paul Newman's portrayal of Doc Hudson for a flashback scene in Cars 3, and especially in the Peanuts movie, where the filmmakers also used archival footage of the late Bill Melendez's performances as both Snoopy and Woodstock. And there's another thing that people have also had an outcry about regarding the movie. The ending, where Woody decides to abandon being Bonnie's toy and decide to be with Bo Peep as a lost toy. A lot of people think that this aspect just completely ruins the whole purpose of Woody's character as the leader and straight man to the other toys. And yeah, it kinda does. Then again, a lot of people didn't even want a Toy Story 4 in the first place anyway. But on the whole, this film is a very mixed bag. What with all the plot holes, the underuse of the familiar characters that we've all grown to love, the new characters introduced not really making much of an impression with audiences, and the complete left turn from the ending of Toy Story 3. However, even though I agree with a lot of people regarding the problems with this film, it's actually a guilty pleasure for me because I loved the Toy Story films growing up, and I still do to this day. After all that's been said about this film, you all know what that means. Toy Story 4 gets 7.5 stars. Even after the release of Toy Story 4, there's been news that Disney and Pixar is now working on a Toy Story 5. I mean, how are you going to make a Toy Story 5 even after the mediocrity that is Toy Story 4? Especially regarding the ending where Woody abandons his old friends to be reunited with Bo Peep again. It's almost similar to when they made sequels to The Land Before Time, Alpha and Omega, and even The Fast and the Furious, with a lot of those sequels being either really good or really bad. Though in the case of Alpha and Omega, the sequels were just absolute garbage and were a complete contradiction to the first Alpha and Omega film. But back to Toy Story. I remember that the news of a Toy Story 5 was first announced, alongside that of Zootopia 2 and Frozen 3. I mean, a Zootopia 2 I can understand, but how are you going to make a Toy Story 5 and a Frozen 3? If Disney is smart, then they can hopefully hire a new CEO who actually cares about good, wholesome entertainment and cancel Toy Story 5 and Frozen 3. Then again, I have heard people give their own theories about Toy Story 5, even speculating that it might involve an adult Andy having a family of his own and deciding to reclaim his old toys so that his own children would enjoy them as much as he did during his youth. But either way, it doesn't really matter, because there's still lots of other people that think that making a Toy Story 4 and now a Toy Story 5 is just completely unnecessary and ruins the whole story. Why can't the filmmakers learn to just leave well enough alone? Because you know the old saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Okay, I think I'm done rambling now, especially since that wraps up this episode of Cave Cats movie and TV reviews. As mentioned before, be sure to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more episodes or other videos that'll come your way. So until next time, later!